we're going to be talking about race, and language, and geography, and how it affects our reading. We sometimes, and I'll repeat this again, we sometimes say that things go without saying, that we read it and we say, well, we didn't have to say anything about that. So that's what we're going to be talking about. It's easy for us to, especially, I guess, easier here in America, for us to think in ideal terms and because we know we have laws that say we can't discriminate according to race, gender, and things like that. And we believe that America is a country that's based on equality, and all of our documents, all of our historical documents tend to talk about that equality. But in reality, we don't actually have that. This is just a real short verse, so I'm not going to tell you to turn to it. But in Romans chapter 3, verse 22, maybe some of you know it by heart. Nope. Okay. It says, there is no difference between Jew and Gentile. We hear that and we say, well, then things must be equal, and they're not. Here's another question. I feel like I'm playing quiz game on TV. What do you know about the word race? When did people start using the word race? Historically, it's a relatively new word. It was first coined in 1580, and it comes from both a French word and an Italian word that sound like race, and it's the Italian was rasa. And so anyway, in 1580 in England, and again, I'll ask you this, what do you know about the English society and their view of race? Did they have an upper crust society? Did they have a lower, almost a caste system? I mean, if you watch Downton Abbey, you know that
Downstairs.
there was a downstairs and upstairs, and some people got to be upstairs, and the ones downstairs never got to be an upstairs people. They just stayed where they were. And that kind of division permeated that whole English culture. It wasn't just hierarchical as far as money and education and things like that, but they also were the ones who were talking about policies where they dealt with people differently. Again, we'll see your history knowledge. What was the relationship? And I'm going to ask you to think of a Mel Gibson movie. What was the relationship of the English to the Irish? What movie was he in?
Not good.
Braveheart.
Braveheart.
Yeah.
And he was Irish. And the English thought that they were beneath them, and they mistreated the Irish. In fact, they thought of them as barbarians. And if you look at how Braveheart dressed, you might think that he was a barbarian. So we had the English wanted to, on several times, conquer the Irish people, and they really did want to say they were a separate kind of people. They weren't the same as English people. And so this is when the word race started coming into into our language. Now, the biblical world was ethnically diverse, but there was problems of language and culture and customs, and it affected race. Be careful how I word this. What do we do when we're in our group like we are here? We all feel very comfortable. I went overseas, and when I was overseas, I felt very, very uncomfortable with the people that live there. I know people that are afraid to go to Harlem because Harlem is not Lubbock white. Now, is that, how else do we find ways to distinguish between locals and out-of-towners? How do we know? Can you give some examples?
Dress,
Dress,
language.
language. I don't know, have you ever been to a place where we, like when we go to Santa Fe, inevitably we'll find ladies dressed in garb that we would never even consider. And I'm always curious, what are they? What religion are they that they dress that way? The Amish people are examples of people say, why? Why do you dress that way? And so we do have examples of that. Later we're going to talk about how language differentiates us. And I'm going to get ahead of myself a little bit and just get you thinking about that. Can you think of examples of how people know that you're not from here because you talk funny?
Nope.
No?
When I went to Pennsylvania the first time to visit your family, they all thought I talked funny, and I thought they talked funny. So
I get that all the time. Even now, after living here for what, 45 years, people still say, you're not from around here.
Because you don't say my last name right.
Who
You don't
does?
say it correctly.
Me?
Say it. How do you say their last name?
Taylor?
Taylor?
You usually say, how does he say it? You don't say Taylor, you say Taylor or something like that.
I apologize.
Well, wait a like.
Yeah.
I hope so.
He does.
Here's my take on the other side of that. And again, I'm getting ahead of myself, but while we're having fun, but at my expense. When I was teaching at Lubbock High, the kids would say that they were out driving the night before and they ran their car into a bar ditch. And I went, a what? And they said a bar ditch. And I said, what kind of bar was in it? And they went, no, it's a bar ditch. And I said, no, it's not. It's a barrow ditch, B-A-R-R-O-W. Get look it up on your phones. It's the ditch that runs along the side of the road. It's a barrow ditch. The thing is, in Texas, we tend to drag things out or shorten them. We say, well, I drive down the road and I hit that old bar ditch. And they lose the O-W in it. Bar ditch. And it's not a bar ditch.
don't even get me started on what Pennsylvania people talk like.
Well, I won't. Shut up.
Oh, you have been all out now.
You're
And
right.
And I said that to my wife, who I'm married to today for 54 years. Okay, let's look at a Bible thing. If you can, so I can save my relationship. Turn to Genesis chapter 27. in verse 46. It says, then Rebekah said to Isaac, I'm disgusted with living because of these Hittite women. If Jacob takes a wife from among the women of this land, from Hittite women like these, my life will not be worth living. Now, there was something about Hittite women that got under her skin. What do you think it was? Normally, we read something like that and it goes without saying. We just, well, she didn't like it. Okay, that's, but there's usually a reason for stuff like that. In Deuteronomy, I'm sorry, in when Rebecca said that, what was she trying to say? Why would she not like the Hittite women? Okay, I'll give you a hint. Turn to Deuteronomy chapter 20, verses 16 through 18. Deuteronomy 20, 16 through 18. Somebody want to read that for me?
However, in the cities of the nations, the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance, do not leave alive anything that breathes. Completely destroy them. The Hittites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and Jebusites, as the Lord your God has commanded you. Otherwise, they will teach you to follow all the detestable things they do in worshiping their gods, and you will sin against the Lord your God.
Okay. They were, because God said it, reviled. They were people that were hated and should be killed. And the very fact that someone would have a son, marry one of them, is bad. But not only that, what did those Hittite women probably do? How did they affect her son?
And do what they want.
Stray from the faith.
Stray from the faith,
Yeah.
worship idols. They did the women, did the people of that country, you think, have any other vices that they probably didn't like? Think about the Corinthians. Were there people in Corinth that engaged in debauchery, and drunkenness, and prostitution, and things like that? So what did the people do? And so it wasn't just that they made them worship idols. It was that they ate away at their moral fiber. They would drag them off to another culture and change their children. And so God hardened the hearts of the Canaanites, and because they refused to seek a treaty with Joshua. Now, turn to Genesis chapter 9. We won't read the whole chapter or anything, but I want you to look at it. In Genesis chapter 9, God has a covenant with Noah. And he sets this covenant, and we get down to the sons of Noah. And it says the sons of Noah who came out of the ark were Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Ham was the father of Canaan. These were the three sons of Noah, and from them came the people who were scattered over the whole earth. Noah, a man of soil, proceeded to plant a vineyard. And you know the story. When he drank some of its wine, he became drunk and lay uncovered inside his tent. Ham, the father of Canaan, saw his father naked and told his two brothers outside. But Shem and Japheth took a garment and laid it across their shoulders. Now, if you look at commentaries on part of that chapter, and especially if you look at how the Jews perceived this, it wasn't that he just walked in the room and went, oops. He did more than that. He actually laid down with him. And the Jews believe that he did more than just lay down with him. And it became a really unbiblical relationship, an incestuous relationship. When he found out, he said, after he woke up from the wine thing, found out what his youngest son had done to him. Remember, it wasn't just, I'm looking at you, it was what he did to him. He said, cursed be Canaan, the lowest of slaves will he be to his brothers. He also said, praise be to the Lord, the God of Shem. May Canaan be the slave of Shem. May God extend Japheth's territory, and may he live in the tents of Shem, and may Canaan be the slave of Japheth. Now, just from a historical thing here in America, particularly in England and in early America, that section of Genesis is what people use, religious and otherwise, to justify slavery, because those people from Canaan were the ones who would have been considered the slaves, the ones from Africa. And I mean, this is just his history, if you read it. And so this biblical scriptures, when they said, well, we shouldn't have slaves, they say, oh yeah, look at Genesis, it says, and we are the descendants of, and therefore it's okay if we have slavery. And so all of that carried big weight to the people at the time. And I guess the irony to that really is that throughout a lot of history, the Israelites were the ones who were slaves. They were taken they were turned into slaves by different cultures, and they were in Egypt and other countries. And so there's a little bit of irony there, the fact that they themselves were slaves, but it was okay to have slavery here, and people justified that using this scripture. If you have comments, feel free to say something if you think I'm wrong or going down that, or if you have questions. I just want to point this out that they had a history as a people that went so far back to Noah that affected their relationship with other people. They didn't call them races. What the better word would be ethnicities. And so as they moved, I'm going to read from this will be Genesis 26:34 and Genesis 26:35. When Rebecca I don't know how much of the story to get into. She had told Jacob concerning the enmity of Esau to Jacob and his intentions to kill him. lest he should grieve him and bring his gray hairs with sorrow to the grave. But what follows was an excuse to get Isaac's leave for Jacob's departure, concealing the true reason of it. I am weary of my life because of the daughters of Heth, whom Esau married. So Esau went off and he married the daughters of Heth, not just one, but multiple. And I'm just going to read this part. He said, Esau had married of the same tribe or of other of the tribes of the Canaanites, which were in religion and manners like unto them. So she said, what good shall my life do? I shall have no comfort in it. Death would be more eligible in such a life. This she said with great vehemence and affection to move and work upon Isaac, to lay him commands of Jacob. So I knew I'd mess up that language, but in the stories with Jacob and Esau and I can talk about Moses as well. The people had reasons to not like other people. When we read those, in a minute, I'm going to ask you to look at the book of Ruth. You all know the book of Ruth. Jumping ahead a little bit. But in the book of Ruth, and you may not remember this, every time Ruth's name is mentioned, what's the next phrase?
Moabite.
A Moabite woman. Because a Moabite woman wasn't supposed to be worth anything. And none of the other people are identified. You don't see them saying any other character in that story and then give his ethnicity or his region that he came from or the city that he came from. It's only with Ruth the Moabite. I'm going to talk a little bit more about this geography thing. Paul started churches in, and I should ask you if you know all the names of them. I don't, but I've never memorized them. But he started in the towns of Derbe, Lystra, Iconium. In Acts chapter 16, it says, Paul came also to Derbe and to Lystra. A disciple was there named Timothy, the son of a Jewish woman who was a believer, but his father was a Greek. He was well spoken of by the brothers at Lystra and Iconium. Paul wanted Timothy to accompany him, and he took him and circumcised him because of the Jews who were in those places. For they all knew that his father was a Greek. As they went on their way through the cities, they delivered to them for observance the decisions that had been reached by the apostles and elders who were in Jerusalem. So the churches were strengthened in the faith and increased in numbers daily. In verse 6 of that chapter, it says, and they went to the region of Phrygia and Galatia, having been forbidden by the Holy Spirit to speak the word in Asia. But when they had come up to Mysia, they attempted to go into Bithynia, but the Spirit of Jesus did not allow them. So they bypassed Mysia and went down to Troas. And this is where we get into the Macedonian call. Now, this northern region was Galatia. Now, remember this. Galatia is the northern region. And the Galatia was a mispronunciation by the Romans of the name for the Celts, C-E-L-T-S. And those Celts had moved there from Europe, and they mispronounced it. They considered them barbarians which was a term for someone who did not speak Greek. The word barbarian to them equated probably to us saying blah, 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 because they said they didn't know how to talk. All they heard was, and what's the saying that we use if we don't understand something? It's Greek to me. We've turned that. The Greeks and Romans said, these people talk, but we don't understand them, so we're going to call them barbarians because they don't know how to speak the language right, so therefore they must be barbarians. And we turn it around and say, we are barbarians. Whatever you're saying is above our heads. It's Greek to us. We have that same standard. Greek is the high standard. And if you don't understand Greek, then you're just saying blah. It's like blah, 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 blah. By the way, do you know of any other words that something that came from that's different? You want to learn something? How many of you know where the word assassin came from? During the Crusades, the enlightened people from England would have their crusade and go and try and save Jerusalem and save Christianity. And they would go there, and when they were in Jerusalem, Muslims would entice them up to the rooftops and give them hashish, similar to marijuana. And when they got high, they would push them off the roof and they would die. And so those people would warn them and say, whatever you do, when you get to Jerusalem, be careful of the Hashishans because they'll kill you. And assassins is the word that comes from Hashishans, because we didn't want to keep saying the Hashishans, and we dropped the H's and turned it into assassins. There you go, you just learned something. And that's the same principle that was happening with the people at the time. So Galatia was that northern part. Now, the Greeks had their vision of what those people were like. Luke, on the other hand, knew the inhabitants of the southern region preferred their provincial names. They didn't want anyone confusing them or associating them with the north. If you look at chapter 2 of Acts, verses 9 and 10, he says, Parthians, Medes, and Elamites, residents of Mesopotamia, Judea, Cappadocia, Pontus, and Asia, Phrygia and Pamphylia, Egypt, and the parts of Libya, near Cyrene, and visitors from Rome. He knew that if he had used those other names, if he had used the names that were similar to the Galatians, that would be an insult. And so you had to be aware of that. It's similar to if somebody from New York came down here and said, you know, Texas, it's kind of like the backwaters of Texas. You know, you'd say we're insulted. When the people from the Metroplex found out that they were going to be playing Texas Tech, why would anybody want to go to sports people in here? What did they say? Why would anybody want to go to the desert? And then hence Texas Tech started doing the cactus thing. Now, we insult people because of their geography all the time. And we shorten it to things like rednecks and things like that. Now remember, I just told you Galatians was a bad place. What did Paul say to the people in Galatia when they were doing things wrong? Now, these are people in Galatia. Chapter 3, verse 1. He said, "You stupid Galatians." And we just assume that because he said Galatians, it was just a location. But everybody in that region, everybody knew Galatians were barbarians. They were ignorant. They didn't know how to speak. They were below everybody else. It was a bad place to be from. You didn't want to be, it's like being a Yankee down here. You don't want to tell people around here that you're a Yankee. You lose jobs and families disown you and things like that. Now, that's what he was doing. This wasn't a "you foolish Galatians" because I'm writing a letter to Galatia. He's insulting them to get their attention. They know what it meant to be called a Galatian. Can you think of anything that you know in our society that's
Just like you said, you dumb rednecks. I mean,
that
yeah.
there might be? I mean, I may be as wrong as I can be, but how many times have you heard something about California and what was your response? Oh, it's California. No one,
Mhm.
right? They're weird out there. And so we label that whole state as being something that has negative connotations to it. And it may not be true. But let's go on. Look at Acts 21. Let's see what's going on there. In Acts 21, Paul, if I can find the verse. Paul's arrival at Jerusalem, starting in verse 17, he was warmly greeted. He said, "There are 4 men with us who have made a vow," down in verse 23. And he says, "Take these men, join in their purification rites, and pay their expenses so that they can have their heads shaved. Then everyone will know there is no truth in his reports about you, but that you yourself are living in obedience to the law. As for the Gentiles believers, we have written to them their decision they should abstain from food," and so on. The next day, Paul took them in and purified himself along with them. You know anything about the purification rites? They had to shave their heads. And so Paul shaved his head like the other 4 men. And he went to give it to the temple. And when the 7 days were nearly over of this purification rite, some Jews from the province of Asia saw Paul at the temple. They stirred up the whole crowd and seized him, shouting, "Help us. This is the man who teaches everyone everywhere against our people and our law in this place. And besides, he has brought Greeks into the temple and defiled the holy place." And they had previously seen Trophimus and the Ephesian in the city with Paul and assumed that Paul had brought him into the temple. They were aroused. Now, the commander came up in verse 33 and arrested him and ordered him to be bound with chains. Then he asked who he was and what he had done. And they all called out different things. Now, basically, what happened was Paul was with these people because he had his head shaved, and they weren't of the people that were there. They were different. The police, in effect, just said, I can't tell a difference. They didn't know. Did they know that he was a Roman citizen at that time? No, they just arrested him. And he had rights. But they just assumed it's kind of like, I'm not trying to be racist, but I can make distinctions in this classroom between you all. If I were to go to, and I know this is a fact, there's a difference between Japanese and Chinese people. You know how people can tell generally? Because of the shape of their eyes and the slant. And to me, they all look the same. I'm not used to making those kind of distinctions. And that's what they were doing here with him. They were assuming that he wasn't who he was or where he came from. They made assumptions based on ethnicity, what they thought he was. And we see that kind of thing all throughout the Bible. And like I said, we tend to overlook those things when we're reading and trying to understand what it was that was actually going on in the story. Let's try one more just to give you an idea. I'll read this part to you. And you'll remember the story. Miriam and Aaron spoke against Moses because of the Cushite woman whom he had married. For he had married a Cushite woman. And they said, has the Lord indeed spoken only through Moses? Has he not spoken through us also? And the Lord heard it. Now, why do you think they talked about him marrying a Cushite woman? You've read it before. I know you've heard the story. Aaron and his wife rise up against Moses, and they said, he married that Cushite woman. And you read it, and you went, okay, cool. You married a Cushite woman. What's their beef? You know anything about the Cushites? Okay. First of all, they come from the lower end of the Nile Valley. They were very dark skinned. They were black, but they were great warriors, great business people. They had a very thriving, good culture. Were they upset because he married a black person? Probably not, because those people were some of the ones who would have had Hebrews as slaves. What their real gripe was, they thought that he probably, I think of my words, he probably married above himself. That's good. You know, people always say that, you know, how do they say it? I married somebody, you know, above my standard. Well, that's what they might have been thinking about. But as you read that in, if you read that into that story, then you go down further and you see God tells them to come out of the tent of meeting. And he came down in a pillar of cloud and stood at the entrance of the tent and called Aaron and Miriam. And they both came forward. And he said, hear my words. If there's a prophet among you, I, the Lord, make myself known to him in vision. I speak with him in a dream, but not so with Moses. He is faithful in all my house. With him I speak mouth to mouth, clearly, and not in riddles, and he beholds the form of the Lord. Why then were you not afraid to speak against my servant Moses? And the anger of the Lord was kindled against them, and he departed. And here's the key thing. You know what happened next? Remember? God left. Aaron turned, and his wife was covered with leprosy. Did you find it? You search it, find out. I was reading from the Bible, by the way. It says, when the cloud removed from over the tent, behold, Miriam was leprous like snow. And Aaron turned toward Miriam, and behold, she was leprous. We tend to think of places and assign attributes to those places. And because of those attributes that we assign to them, those things that we think about them, it turns out that we may be misreading some of it. If you didn't know the history of the Cushites and realize that Moses marrying a Cushite woman really wasn't the issue. They talked about it, but that really wasn't the issue. The issue was they thought that he was thinking he was better than himself because he was, it says in the Bible that he was the meekest man on earth. And so he wouldn't have done that. Questions? Sorry if I'm boring you too much with that. We talked about geography a little bit. Let's go back to
First of all, William, let's make this straight. I thought, and I still think, Moses and Aaron and Miriam were brothers and sisters. There was no, am I right?
Yeah, they are, because Miriam is their sister.
Yes.
okay, sorry, I
Okay.
misspoke.
Just wanted to make sure that.
I was worrying about the other. I misspoke. I apologize. Now you got me off. Remember, I was telling you, we talked a little bit about geography. How important was Jerusalem in the scheme of things historically? We place a lot of importance on it, don't we, when we read the Bible? But in reality, the whole of Israel was like, here's the Roman Empire, and here on the fringe of it is Israel, or where Jerusalem is, that area. It was a backwater place. It had no importance tax-wise. There weren't enough people for them to have a big tax impact for Rome. Why would they even have people there? Why would Jerusalem even be considered when we're talking about the story of Jesus and Rome and Christianity? What's the significance of Jerusalem, Palestine? Where were all the rabble rousers? Were the Romans? And they always had to round up people. Who were the ones among the Jews that were fighting the Romans because they were waiting for the Messiah to come?
And the ends and the. Oh, yeah.
Took me off. But I know what you're saying.
Okay, so Herod oversaw that part of the country from 25 BC on. He put down all the insurrections. He raised a few dollars for Rome, and Rome never had to worry about it.
because
Herod took care of it.
he was in essence a tax collector,
He
a
was
high
tax
level
collector.
tax collector, but he had the power to put down any insurrections. They were really not a, they weren't like some sort of a breadbasket where people needed. The only thing that they really had going for them was they were a trade route. And because of the trade route, the Romans needed to keep that, because if you were in Egypt and you wanted to get to Italy, other than going by sea, how would you get there? You'd have to go up and around to go to the rest of the Roman Empire or go across the sea. So it was a trade route. It connected Egypt with Europe and the Near East. Just an observation for you. We tend to think that Jerusalem was this major Christian player from 638 AD until the 19th century, the 1800s. Jerusalem was primarily a Muslim city. That's why they had the Crusades, to try and get people out. And when the Crusades came, for a while, it did have a Christian majority. But usually that whole area was Muslim dominated. And that played a great part in how things happen. I alluded to the book of Ruth and how she was always identified as, and you look at that in chapter 4, every time Boaz redeems Ruth, he's redeeming her. He has a relationship with her, but he still calls her by her geographic name. And he doesn't identify anybody else that way.
But there's a reason that he did that. It wasn't just the geography, right?
No. What would be the reason?
It was, she was a Moabite, which was Esau's clan, which was first from the beginning. So nobody from that realm would ever hold the throne, would ever have any benefit to anybody.
Yeah, God said for 10 generations,
Yeah.
no Moabite would. But yet, ironically, Ruth is the one who is mentioned, and she's mentioned in favorable terms.
Well, she was in Jesus' genealogy.
Yeah, I mean, that was important. But the geography, everybody would think, who's this Moabite woman? What's the deal with her? And we tend to do that sometimes. We want to look at people and say, because of where they came from, can they be of any good? I mean, look at, what did they think about Jesus? The Jews would say, can anything good come out of Nazareth? And why would any king be born in a place like Bethlehem? And so the geography caused a lot of issues, not only for the people, language did as well. I'm touching this, we only have a few minutes. What's the story of just went blank. I'm trying to pull this out. Ephraimites and the Canaanites. I should know this story. I'm just pulling this out.
The two groups that didn't go take their land in Israel.
Yeah, but there was a battle, and the Ephraimites, I'll say the Canaanites. I should have.
Amalekites.
Huh?
Amalekites. They attacked in the rear.
Yeah, well, they had a battle, or they're gonna have a battle, and the Ephraimites had to come through and they had to say a word, shibboleth. Remember the story? Do you?
Mhm. And they couldn't pronounce it.
And they couldn't pronounce it. They couldn't put the H in there, so they said sibboleth instead of shibboleth. And every one of them got cut to pieces. 40,000 plus men were asked, say this word, and they couldn't say the word, and that's how they knew the difference. So language is even important. I'm sorry I didn't know that. I was just, as I was reading, I read that story, and I'm like, oh yeah, that's part of it too. So the language is even an important part of it. So when we read, we tend to read it in terms of what we know and what we think and what we see. And because we're from the West, we don't know what the people from the biblical times would know. If we wouldn't know that, and it can sometimes change how we interpret what that means. The same way those early preachers would say, yep, Genesis 9 says we can have slaves, but it doesn't. So they had slaves, but it doesn't mean that we can. That's not a justification for us to have slaves, because they read what they wanted to read into it based on their language, their culture, what they believed, their geography, their history. And that's what we have to be careful of when we're reading the Bible, that we don't take something that was probably passed down from generation to generation, and we just assumed it was true. Can you think of anything in the church that you know that was passed down that isn't necessarily biblical? I'll give you a hint. Wednesday night class. Doesn't say anywhere in the Bible about Wednesday night class, but yet Nora's father can tell you, if the door's open, you better be there, right? And how many of us were taught that? You know, if the door's open, you got to be there. And but that's not saying that. I'll get myself in real trouble here. Tell me where it says Sunday night is in the Bible. It's not. But, and I'm not against worshiping on Sunday nights. Don't get me wrong. But we read things into the Bible based on our culture, either what's been passed down or what we believe to be true. It's not always that way. It can't go without saying that this is true. Sorry. Questions? No? Complaints? Other than my mistake with Miriam, I'm sorry. I was so busy trying to talk about the story about the Cushites. I misspoke. Okay. It's 1 minute till. Enjoy the discussion till the bell rings. Oh, by the way, there is no class next week because we're having
Old church, you know.
all church devo.